My daughter-in-law stood up right in the middle of the will reading and coldly declared that she would remove me from my husband's entire estate worth $52 million. I sat there completely still, like a statue someone had forgotten to dust off. There wasn't even a tear left for me to shed. I had been the one beside Harold during his final months, when he could no longer walk on his own, when every breath grew heavier, and now Jada Kingsley was behaving as if I had never existed in her father's life at all. But just when everything seemed settled, the attorney suddenly laughed. A strange laugh, one no one understood, and at that moment, something inside me shifted. What had Harold hidden before he closed his eyes for the last time? And why did I feel as if he was still trying to tell me something from the other side? You still think this is just an ordinary inheritance dispute? Trust me, this story is only beginning. Stay with me, because what comes next will make you see everything in a completely different way. I stood alone in the small garden after the funeral, watching the last guests quietly drive away. They left behind half-full cups, a few folding chairs leaning awkwardly, and the lingering scent of freshly cut lilies still hanging in the air. But no one turned back to ask if I needed a ride home. Not even Jada. Of course not. She had arranged everything, from fresh flowers, the photo slideshow, down to the disposable coffee cups. Every detail was executed so perfectly, it felt less like a farewell and more like stepping into a carefully curated performance. Cold, flawless, every second calibrated as if timed by some indifferent clock. Harold would have hated it. He always said funerals should be a little messy. People should cry loudly, tell jokes that aren't funny, drop umbrellas under the chairs, and forget where they put them. A funeral should feel human, should feel real. But Harold's farewell was nothing like that. It felt like a stage play that had been rehearsed too many times, and I was merely an uninvited spectator. When I stepped back inside the house, I saw Jada gathering documents on the dining table. I cleared my throat, trying to start a conversation, but she didn't bother to look up, just kept stacking papers with stiff, precise motions like a machine. "We'll move forward with the legal procedures next week," she said, her voice flat like she was reading an announcement. "I've already worked with the law firm." No mention of me, no asking what I wanted, no acknowledgement that for the past 6 months I had slept on the chair beside Harold's hospital bed while she flew from one conference to another. I told myself maybe it was stress or grief or simply that Jada didn't know what to say to me. But then she handed me a small box labeled Harold. "Harold asked me to give this to you," she said. Inside was a tie clip, just a simple silver tie clip. No letter, no note. Even though Harold had an entire drawer full of journals and handwritten letters, we used to leave sticky notes for each other, even while living under the same roof. And yet, in the end, all I received was a tie clip, not even one he wore often. Jada gave me a polite smile and walked away, as if everything had concluded, as if she had just closed the book on the two of us with one arrogant snap. That night, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of cold tea, and for the first time since Harold left this world, I felt I no longer belonged in the home we had built together. The walls still carried the faint scent of his aftershave. His books still lined the hallway, but my name, my presence, felt erased, quietly, deliberately. The loneliness that night did not feel like the grief of losing a husband. It felt like standing inside your own home while someone wiped away every trace of you, one by one, without explanation. I told myself maybe I was overthinking, maybe I was just tired. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. A coldness had crept into the air, one that had nothing to do with loss. The invitation arrived by email. Cold, formal, sent by Jada's assistant, not Jada herself. The subject line was painfully short. "The estate management meeting has been scheduled." I stared at that sentence for a long time, unsure whether to feel insulted or simply numb. The meeting was set for Wednesday at 9 a.m. at the law firm Jada worked with in downtown Chicago. No message. No, "hope you're doing all right." Just time and location. As cold as an appointment reminder for a dental cleaning. That morning, I arrived 5 minutes late. Traffic was terrible, and I'd pulled over twice, unsure if I had the courage to walk inside. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped into a glossy lobby, smelling of eucalyptus and printer ink, as if emotions weren't allowed there. A young assistant glanced at me with surprise, as though she wondered how I had even gotten in. I smoothed my coat and followed her into the meeting room. The door closed behind me with a soft but sharp click, like the ceiling of a vault. 7 people sat around the long table, all in dark suits. Jada sat at the head, her hair neatly pinned, eyes locked on the pile of documents before her. She didn't stand, didn't greet me, didn't even look at me. Just a small nod, as if to signal, "You may sit over there." I took the only empty seat at the far end, far from the documents, far from the coffee, far from everything. No one handed me a packet. No one spoke. No one acknowledged I existed. Jada cleared her throat. "As executor of the estate," she began, voice clear and sharp as glass, "I will present the asset distribution according to the finalized will." Her tone was exactly the same as when she chaired a board meeting, void of warmth, void of feeling. I straightened my back, folded my hands in my lap. In that room, I was the only one without a pen. I must have looked like someone who'd wandered into the wrong meeting. She listed stocks, trust accounts, 2 commercial properties in Evanston, and a stake in a vineyard Harold invested in with friends. Then she announced that Harold had transferred primary control of the family trust to her 6 months prior. I blinked, disbelieving. I had co-managed that trust with Harold for nearly 20 years. He would never hide something so significant, unless something had happened. The moment felt like watching a movie of your own life, only to discover the protagonist is someone else. Each sentence Jada read was like a brushstroke repainting history, and in that new portrait, I no longer existed. Jada continued reading the allocations as if listing items in a frozen warehouse. My name was not mentioned, not even once. Finally, one of the assistants hesitantly asked, "And Mrs. Moreland's portion?" Jada barely lifted her head. "There is no distribution designated for her under the current record." That was it. No eye contact, no explanation, just a brief sentence. Yet it was a silent verdict against my entire existence. A strange heat ran down my spine, but my hands remained still on my lap. I said nothing, and everyone else said nothing too. The silence stretched so long it felt insulting, but the meeting continued as though nothing had happened. When it ended, I stayed until everyone had left. Jada packed her briefcase slowly, almost intentionally waiting for me to speak. But I refused to give her that privilege. I stood, adjusted my scarf, and walked out without looking back. Outside, the cold wind slapped my cheek, as if to keep me conscious. I didn't cry. I wasn't shaking with rage. I simply felt a hollow space open inside me, like I had just watched my life fold into a file and slide under someone else's name. Jada hadn't just taken control of the estate. She had taken the story, the home, the history. She had spoken through my silence, and no one in that room questioned whether it was true. As I walked toward the parking lot, one sentence echoed in my mind, clear as metal scraping against metal. There is no distribution designated for her. I was no longer a widow. I was no longer Harold's companion of a lifetime. I wasn't even a line item. I was nothing. I returned home and sat in the dark for the rest of the afternoon. I didn't want to turn on the lights. The silence in that big house felt heavier than any conversation I could endure. I still hadn't touched the last of Harold's belongings brought home from the hospital. His cane still leaned beside the back door, exactly where he placed it the last time we came home from radiation. I hadn't moved it. I couldn't. That night, guided by some vague instinct, I opened the desk drawer in Harold's study. No intention, no plan. My hands moved before my mind knew why. The drawer opened with its familiar creak. Harold always said it needed oiling. I always said I liked the sound, because it felt like a sign he was still home. Inside were the little things only Harold would keep: old envelopes, book order receipts, the mechanical pencil he always carried, shopping lists scribbled on sticky notes. But in the very back, beneath a fabric-bound notebook, was a thin manila folder I had never seen. No label, no date. I opened it. Inside were 3 sheets of paper. The first was a handwritten draft. His handwriting, unmistakable, even though shaky. No greeting, no signature, just a short note in that quiet tone I knew by heart. Jada wants me to update the will. She says it needs to reflect current assets. I asked why now, and she said for clarity. I think she's being careful, too careful. She started drafting documents on my behalf. I haven't signed anything. I haven't told Angela. I know she'd ask questions I'm afraid of. I stared at the paper. My eyes scanned the lines again and again, searching for a different meaning I wished existed. But the message was as sharp as a blade. Harold had doubts. He didn't tell me. He sensed something was wrong, yet chose silence. The second sheet was a photocopy of a recent will draft I had never seen. In the meeting, Jada presented a signed version, but this one was clearly different. There were margin notes, edits, and red ink circles. My name had once been there. The sentence: "In the event of my passing, I bequeath my personal assets, including my share of the home and designated accounts, to my wife, Angela Moreland." That line was crossed out. In the margin, in handwriting, "Discuss with Jada." The third sheet was a typed appointment log: legal consultations, specialist meetings. 2 of the dates overlapped with the period Harold was in treatment. I didn't know who he met. I was with him almost every minute during that time. The only moments he was alone were when Jada came to take over my shift. The files were thin, only a few pages, but they weighed on my lap like concrete. I set them back on the desk and leaned back, watching the ceiling fan turn slowly overhead. I closed my eyes, trying to remember the last time Harold and I talked about the will. It was a normal dinner: warm light, grilled fish, the old radio playing soft jazz. He looked at me and said, "Don't worry about anything, Angela. I've made sure of everything." I remember the way he reached out for my wrist, the gentle press of his thumb on my skin, reassuring. Now, all I could feel was the coldness of absence. Sometimes, truth doesn't arrive with an explosion. It arrives in thin sheets of paper, trembling handwriting, and the realization that the person you loved tried to protect you, but simply ran out of time. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the study until the sky turned from black to pale gray. With each rereading, I became more certain. This wasn't a mistake, not an office error, not negligence. It was intentional. Jada had orchestrated something, and Harold had seen it, perhaps tried to stop it, but he no longer had the strength. And now it was my turn to face that truth. I placed the pages back into the manila folder and hid it under a stack of old National Geographic magazines in the hall closet. Safe, discreet, far enough that no one, especially Jada, would accidentally find it. I still didn't know what I would do next. No plan, no strategy, but I knew one thing: I couldn't let this pass as if it never happened. The next morning, I called Marcus Lanier. It had been years since we last spoke, since Harold's retirement party. Marcus was the kind of person whose presence filled a room without him ever raising his voice. Harold trusted him, and I always felt secure when Marcus was part of important conversations. He picked up after 2 rings. When I said my name, there was the slightest pause, small, but enough for me to sense his surprise mixed with concern. Then Marcus's voice came through, deep, steady, grounded as always. He didn't ask why I called. He simply said, "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., same place." He knew. Maybe he always knew when a storm was coming. I hung up and stood by the living room window, looking out at the front yard. The wind was ripping through the last remaining maple leaves, trees Harold had planted 30 years ago. He used to say they would outlive both of us, and it seemed to be coming true. Sometimes nature speaks for the things we cannot admit. when leaves fall, when wind shifts, when a tree stands still, yet senses the world trembling. In that moment, I understood I had stepped into a path I could not turn back from. I placed my hand on the cold window frame and told myself, I will not let silence be the last thing Harold leaves behind. Not while I am still breathing. Not while the truth sits in someone else's hands. Marcus met me at a small, quiet cafe on Elm Street in Hyde Park. The place hadn't changed at all through the years. The same slightly wobbly wooden chairs, the same chipped ceramic cups, and soft jazz humming from the old speakers overhead. He slid into the seat across from me, his coat still dotted with morning rain. He nodded, nothing more. With Marcus, silence had always been a form of greeting. I didn't beat around the bush. I opened the manila folder I had hidden all night and pushed it toward him. Marcus read slowly, meticulously, his lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes sharp and heavy, as if stitching together a larger picture lurking behind the pages. When he reached the handwritten note from Harold, his eyebrows tightened. He didn't speak immediately, just kept flipping back and forth, as if reconstructing a timeline he sensed but couldn't yet see fully. I sat still, arms wrapped around my cup of cold tea. Watching Marcus read made everything real, so real that it became hard to breathe. The red ink edits, the crossed-out lines with my name, they were no longer part of my imagination. They were right there, exposed before another person. Finally, Marcus spoke. There was no panic, no pity, only a quiet certainty I recognized at once. "This isn't just suspicious," he said. "This is deliberate." He took a small notebook from his coat pocket, opened it, and began writing. He copied the dates in the folder, listed the law firms Jada had mentioned, and circled something I had overlooked. The witness signatures on the updated will were completely unfamiliar. Not neighbors, not old friends, not anyone Harold had ever used before. Harold always used people he trusted, people he knew. The fact that Jada brought in strangers without telling me was a red flag by itself. We agreed to investigate quietly. No confronting Jada, not yet. Marcus would start by requesting a certified copy of the will filed with the county and compare every detail with the folder I found. I would keep everything at home exactly as it was, letting no one know what I had discovered. Sometimes truth doesn't arrive with a thunderclap. It arrives when scattered pieces finally click into place, and you realize the person you trusted most had been fighting silently to protect you, but simply didn't have enough time. Back home, I opened the hall closet and placed the folder into the locked metal box where we kept passports and medical documents. Then I went to Harold's old desk and opened his leather-bound planner. Jada had taken nearly all of Harold's belongings, boxed his books, donated his clothes, sent his golf clubs to a friend. But the planner remained. A simple notebook filled with pencil notes. And that was where I saw the name Hal Givens. A Tuesday morning. His name circled twice. I recognized it. Hal was a tax consultant. Harold had met him years ago while working with a nonprofit. I hadn't spoken to Hal in a long time, but the fact that Harold saw him during his illness, without telling me, stung more than I wanted to admit. I called Marcus with the update. He listened, then said he would look into Hal discreetly. If Hal had been involved during the period Harold was preparing to update his will, even briefly, he might have seen something Jada didn't want anyone to know. The next few days passed so slowly, it felt like time itself was stretching on purpose to test me. I still did the usual things, went to the market, watered the plants, attended my book club meeting, but that week, I hardly opened my mouth. On the outside, I didn't look any different. But inside, every sense was strung tight, as if I were waiting for a storm whose distant rumble only I could hear. By Friday, Marcus called. He had met with Hal Givens, and what he told me made my stomach knot. Hal remembered Harold coming to see him, looking frail, so exhausted he could barely hold a pen. They had spoken for nearly an hour about the trust, about beneficiaries, about ensuring long-term protections for me. Harold had asked very specific, very careful questions, but Hal said he was always hesitant. Harold kept repeating that Jada would take care of everything, that she was helping. Hal had suggested doing an independent review to make sure all documents were filed transparently, without errors. But Harold never came back. A week later, it was Jada who called to cancel the appointment, saying Harold no longer needed the services. Marcus paused on the phone, letting me absorb the weight of that sentence. He said Hal still had all his intake notes. They didn't carry legal weight, but they documented Harold's intent, his doubts, and his worries. And as Marcus put it, sometimes that alone is enough to open the door to a formal investigation. I thanked him, then sat down on the edge of the bed. The phone rested in my hand longer than I realized. That night, I took out an old photo album, not to reminisce, but to see more clearly. Each photograph rose before me. Harold at family gatherings, festivals, warm dinners with friends. And in almost every one, Jada appeared somewhere in the background, smiling, neat, always positioned perfectly, always there at the right moment. I used to see that as dedication. Now I saw calculation. I looked again and couldn't help noticing the signs I had missed before. The way Jada held paperwork, the way she positioned herself at the center of every important discussion, the way people simply accepted whatever she organized as the natural order of things. She had been preparing for this for a long time, step by step, piece by piece. Some betrayals don't begin with shouting. They begin with polite smiles, the cups of coffee she brings, and the way she says, "I'll handle it." Slowly, gently. Until one day, you realize everything has changed and you never even saw it coming. I put the album back on the shelf and turned off the light. Inside me, there was no anger. Not yet. Only a quiet resolve. Whatever Jada has rewritten, I will find a way to rewrite, and this time I will not sit still. I didn't sleep much after the call with Marcus. All my life, I believed in patience, believed that if you give people enough time, they will eventually reveal who they really are. But now, each day passing without answers, felt like I was letting Jada continue rewriting history in whatever way she pleased. By Monday, Marcus called again. His tone had changed, faster, more urgent, but still carried his familiar calm. He said he had reviewed the county records and found something unusual. The final copy of Harold's will, the one that had been filed and enforced, contained several details that differed from the original draft. That alone wasn't enough to set off alarms. But the original version, the one Harold and I had reviewed together a year ago, had disappeared from the official archive. It was marked as superseded, but there was no documentation identifying who had requested that change. Marcus said he wanted to bring in someone else, Desiree Vaughn, an estate litigation specialist who had handled numerous sophisticated will fraud cases. I agreed, even though a vague dread echoed in my chest that the deeper we dug, the more painful what we would find might be. We met Wednesday morning at Marcus's office. Desiree walked in with the sharpness of a woman who knows her own worth. Around 50, composed, her outfit simple, but with no wasted movement. She listened as Marcus laid out what we had so far. She didn't interrupt, didn't rush. Then she began asking questions, not aimed directly at me, but hitting precisely the corners I hadn't dared to think about. She requested copies of everything, notes, calendars, Hal's scanned documents, even the official notices Jada had filed with the county. When Marcus mentioned the two unknown witnesses, she raised an eyebrow, very slightly, but enough for me to see her guard go up. She said their names had surfaced in another case, two unlicensed notaries who were paid to sign documents without being present or reviewing anything. Desiree bent over her legal pad, writing nonstop. Then she looked up, her tone even, but as cold as a thin blade. "This is not carelessness," she said. "This looks constructed." I didn't speak, just watched them, Marcus and Desiree, work with the precision of two surgeons dissecting the remains of my life. Then I stood and walked to the window. Looking down at the city from above, I remembered Harold saying he liked offices with a wide view because they reminded us that no matter how carefully we plan, life continues, calmly, without waiting for anyone. There are moments when you realize you're standing before a truth bigger than anything you've ever feared, not because it is monstrous, but because it confirms what you have long sensed yet never dared to name. Before I left, Desiree said she would file a petition with the probate court to initiate an inquiry, quietly. If Jada had filed any document that wasn't proper, it would have left a trace, an email, a timestamp, or a form disguised as routine bureaucracy. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something move. Not hope, not exactly, but the system beginning to respond. When I got home, I went straight to the garage, the place I had avoided for weeks. I flipped on the light, and the familiar mix of old cigarette smoke and pine cleaner rushed out, as if Harold had just been standing there that morning. I opened his old file cabinet. Inside were the same scratched wooden drawers where he had kept every bill, receipt, and tax document for decades. I pulled out the bottom drawer, the one he always used for the most important records. Inside were folders labeled by year, running back almost 20 years. In last year's folder, I found a document titled Amendment to Revocable Living Trust. It wasn't signed. The language inside had been revised repeatedly, pencil marks, ink edits, sections scratched out, as if Harold had been pacing back and forth between intention and fear. But what twisted my heart was the survivor protection section. My name was there, clear, upright, along with his handwritten notes on additional provisions, health care, housing, legal support, things he wanted to ensure, so I would never have to worry. In the right-hand margin, there was a scribbled line. "We've discussed this. Jada says she'll handle it." I froze for a long time. It felt like witnessing the exact moment Harold let go, perhaps from exhaustion or from trusting the wrong person. The moment he handed over the keys to our entire life to someone who should never have held them. My hands trembled as I made a copy of the document and then called Marcus. He told me to bring it in the next morning. That night, I sat on the porch, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, listening to the wind move through the trees Harold had planted. My body ached in a way I had never felt before, not from age, but from carrying secrets that were never meant to be mine. I thought about how easily my name, the woman who had walked through life with him, had been erased from the will, and how quickly Harold's silence had been filled by someone else. Some truths don't shatter you all at once. They slip quietly into your chest, sit down, and tighten, until you can no longer tell where old pain ends and new wounds begin. For years I thought love meant absolute trust, no questions asked. But that night, under the dim porch light and the cold wind, I understood something else. Love also means protecting the truth when the person who should have done it no longer has the strength. Even when that truth hurts, even when it reopens wounds you thought had healed. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The faint light of early day slipped quietly through the curtains, but I had been awake long before that. I washed, brushed my hair neatly, and chose a well-pressed coat. Not out of vanity, I had no energy for that, but because I needed something solid, some piece of myself restored. The part of me Harold had loved, had married, and had built a life with, not the shadow Jada was trying to erase from every page. I brought the newly found document and went to Marcus's office. Desiree was already there, holding a cup of coffee, her eyes alert in the way of people who haven't slept enough but remain frighteningly sharp. I handed her the file. She read it in silence. No expression, no tutting, not even a sigh. But her lips pressed into a thin line, the only sign that the content was heavier than it looked. When she finished, she looked up. "This will help a great deal." She began explaining their next move, a petition for preservation of assets, a formal request to the court to freeze all of Jada's control over any funds, properties, or transfers related to the estate. If the court granted it, she would be unable to move, sell, transfer, or hide anything until the investigation was complete. It wasn't revenge. It was the first shield. I nodded. I didn't need Jada to suffer. I just needed the truth to have a place to stand. I needed time to breathe, to remember that Harold, the man I loved, was not the one who abandoned me, but the one who had tried to protect me in his weakest days, and had simply trusted the wrong gatekeeper. There are moments when you don't scream, don't break things, don't demand everything back. You simply stand up straight, take a deep breath, and decide that this time you will step forward instead of stepping aside. When I looked into the glass window, at my tired but steady reflection, I understood one thing. If Jada had rewritten the terms of our life, then I had the right to rewrite the ending. Not loudly, not bitterly, but deliberately, and it would begin from this very moment. 3 days later, Desiree called with news that made me sit down right there at the kitchen table. The petition to freeze the estate, the one we had hoped for but didn't dare to expect, had been granted by the court. It was only a temporary order, but its meaning was as clear as metal striking metal. Jada could no longer move money, transfer property, or alter anything belonging to Harold without court oversight. When Desiree finished speaking, I didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't collapse in relief. I simply exhaled. One long breath. Lighter than I thought it would be. It felt like stepping onto solid ground after weeks of drifting at sea. That afternoon, just as I poured myself a cup of tea, I heard the mailbox clatter outside. I opened it and found a thick, elegant envelope with no return address. Inside was a raised print invitation on heavy paper with a faint perfume. Jada was hosting a private event at the country club, a memorial evening for Harold, with high-end cocktails, hors d'oeuvres, and a charity auction in his name. I flipped to the back. The date? Only 4 days away. No call, no message, no check-in. Just a grand invitation sent to me. The woman who had lived with Harold for 43 years, as though I were merely a guest. Nothing more, nothing less. I didn't tear it up. I didn't throw it away. I slid it into the drawer next to the sofa and sat down, letting the silence say what I didn't. Some invitations aren't about honoring anyone, but about seeing where you will stand in that room. And sometimes, accepting that invitation is the strongest act a person who has been pushed aside can make. That night, I called Marcus. I said plainly, "I want to attend." He didn't ask why, didn't try to talk me out of it. He just offered to come along in case anything happened. But I refused, not out of pride, not because I wanted a confrontation, but because I needed to stand in the very room Jada had tried to erase me from. Not to win, not to speak, but to be present, rightfully, as the woman whose hand Harold held last before leaving this world. Saturday came, and I dressed carefully as if preparing for a ritual. Navy slacks, the silk blouse Harold had bought me for our 35th wedding anniversary, a thin silver necklace, and finally, I pinned Harold's small oak-shaped lapel pin to my collar. He always wore it when speaking in public. Steady, rooted, quiet. I needed a bit of that strength from him today. The country club parking lot was already crowded when I arrived. I recognized nearly half the names on the guest list. Friends, colleagues, people who had once sat at my kitchen table, who had raised a glass to Harold during family holidays. Inside, the room glowed under crystal chandeliers, polished wooden floors, fresh flowers on every round table, background music soft as an early summer breeze. Right by the bar stood a gold-framed portrait of Harold, the same one Jada had insisted on using for the obituary, where he looked worn out and his smile so faint it might disappear. I hated that picture. It wasn't him, not the man who had walked through sun and storm with me for 43 years. And Jada. She stood at the center of the room like a natural focal point, elegant, composed, every movement calibrated as precisely as a rehearsed performance. She tilted her head, smiled at each arriving guest, a queen holding court at her own gala. When she saw me, her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before snapping back into perfection. I only nodded. No smile, No polite return. I moved toward a quieter corner near the display table of Harold's favorite items being auctioned off: a signed baseball, a vintage pen, and a first edition novel, the very one I had given him for his birthday. I laid my hand on its spine. My name did not appear on the label. I pulled my hand back as if I'd touched fire. A man approached, introducing himself as one of Harold's former business partners. He said a few kind words, then asked how I planned to manage the estate, whether I intended to adjust any allocations from the trust. He thought I was still the trustee. I told him the truth, plainly. When he heard I had been removed from the will before Harold died, his expression changed at once, still polite, but now confused, awkward, unsettled. He nodded silently and walked away. Just a short conversation, but it said everything. Jada had not told people the truth. Not about the will, not about the transfer of control, not about the auction items she had taken from my house without asking. I stayed another 20 minutes, long enough to hear an old board colleague of Harold's mention, almost offhandedly, that he had received an email from Jada a few weeks before Harold passed. The email contained donation projections, legal phrasing, and the phrase, "managing partner liability." I thanked him, gave a small smile, then excused myself. In the parking lot, I sat in my car with the engine off, both hands on the steering wheel. The air outside felt as heavy as the night before a storm, and that was when everything crystallized. Jada had not waited for Harold to die. She had started arranging everything while he was still alive, still breathing, still trusting. She used his illness as cover, used his loyalty to legitimize each step, and used my painful silence to turn it all into fact. Some betrayals don't happen in the dark. They happen under warm golden lights, in full view of everyone. Only no one notices, except the one left behind. I closed my eyes for a moment. When I opened them, the trembling was gone. Only one thing remained. The silence Jada had depended on was over. The next morning, I went to Marcus and Desiree's office, carrying all the notes I had gathered from the event the night before. Hesitant phrases, gaps in people's stories, odd details that only someone who'd lived beside Harold for 43 years would notice. I set the stack of papers on the table and slid it toward them. Desiree picked up each page, her eyes moving quickly, but sharp as a scalpel. She leaned back in her chair, arms folded, thinking for a moment before she spoke. "This is no longer just a financial matter," she said. "What you've brought today shows very clear signs of premeditation and possibly undue influence." Marcus nodded immediately. He said they would start drafting a petition to contest the will, not only to protect my share, but to restore the integrity of Harold's final wishes, the ones he had tried to preserve before his body no longer allowed him to. As I listened, my chest grew heavier, but not with fear. It was because, at last, someone had named what I had been feeling all along. When the truth begins to take shape, you're no longer just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for someone who can no longer protect himself. And that is a kind of courage no one can teach. Leaving the office, I didn't go straight home. I chose to walk slowly down the street, letting the cool morning air brush against my face. Not because I was exhausted, not because I was lost or searching for answers. I walked slowly, because each step reminded me that I was still here. I was still the woman Harold had trusted for nearly half a century. I was still the one who sat beside him when no one else was in the hospital room. I was still the only person who had seen his eyes when he said, "You don't have to worry about anything, Angela." And now, after all the chatter, all the smiles, all the polite introductions had faded, I was the last one willing to stand up and tell the truth for him. The following Monday arrived with rain, fine, steady, unrelenting. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching the raindrops slide down the glass like gentle reminders that life goes on, even when everything inside you feels paused. At exactly 9:15, Marcus called. His voice was steady, but there was a thread of urgency beneath it. Desiree had officially filed the petition to challenge the will based on suspected fraud and undue influence. The court had accepted the filing and scheduled a preliminary hearing in 2 weeks. The hearing would be brief, just enough to lay groundwork, but the important thing was that it opened the door to discovery. That meant we could request internal emails, financial records, and all digital documentation from Jada's firm. A door that had been sealed shut for so long was finally cracking open. That afternoon, I met Desiree at her office. She was still on a call, so her assistant led me into a small conference room. On the table were thick binders with colored tabs, printed emails, part of a timeline taped to the wall like the map of a complex criminal case. 10 minutes later, Desiree walked in holding a fresh printout. She laid it in front of me. It was an email Jada had sent 6 weeks before Harold's death, marked confidential. Subject line, revised structure, immediate action required. The body was short, but sharp as a knife. Jada instructed the legal team to speed up completion of the trust documents and remove any provisions she considered discretionary. My name appeared only once in a single sentence. Remove co-beneficiary privileges as per our discussion. That was it. 20 lines of text had reduced 4 decades of my life to a bullet point marked for deletion in someone else's email. Desiree didn't look at me. She didn't need to. She just asked one question. "Are you prepared for the hearing and for everything that comes with it?" I answered, "Yes," without a moment of hesitation. There are moments when you realize you are no longer fighting over a share of an estate. You are fighting for the truth, and the truth becomes the only thing worth standing up for. The next few days passed in a whirl of paperwork, emails, timestamp comparisons, and quiet determination. I avoided unnecessary conversations, kept my head down, and every evening I walked around the neighborhood, past houses that still had wreaths hanging from the holiday season. On the surface, nothing had changed, but I knew better. The most dangerous betrayals almost never arrive with sirens. They arrive in emails, in ink, in the act of someone crossing your name off the last line. By Thursday, Desiree had compiled enough to begin issuing subpoenas. She filed a request for full access to Harold's digital communications during the final 6 months of his life. She also requested a deposition for one of Jada's legal assistants, the one who had notarized the disputed documents. Marcus went through each page and pointed out irregularities in 2 signature timestamps. Both were recorded on a Sunday night, when the office was supposed to be closed. I paused over that detail, my hand tightening around the papers. Harold hated working on weekends, and he never signed anything without asking me to read it first. That one Sunday night detail told me more than any sworn statement could. I agreed to let Desiree bring in a handwriting expert. We would compare Harold's signatures from his medical records with those on the revised documents. Even if the legal conclusions ended up limited, the suspicion itself could not be ignored. That night, I sat in silence, not in grief, but in clarity. For the first time in months, I felt the scales begin to tip. Over the weekend, I drove to the cemetery. The sky was low and gray, and so quiet I could hear my own footsteps on the damp ground. Harold's headstone was simple: full name, date of birth, date of death, and a small line. He lived with grace, he left with love. I stood there for a long time, saying nothing, holding no accusations, with no more questions left. Harold had trusted the wrong person. He had left too much undone, but I no longer held that against him, because from now on, I would protect the truth for both of us. When I got home, there was a short message from Desiree. Jada's assistant had agreed to talk. She would sit for a deposition the following Tuesday, and she had kept notes on the irregularities she'd seen. That was the moment I understood. Jada might be able to arrange documents, silence objections, but she had forgotten the hardest thing to control: the quiet observer. On Tuesday morning, the city was still draped in mist when I arrived at Desiree's office. Inside the conference room, the lights were already on. Marcus was sorting a thick file. Desiree stood near the window speaking softly on the phone. On the table sat a recording device and a steaming cup of tea, set out for the guest we were waiting for. She arrived right on time. Talia Rhodes, early 30s, gray cardigan, dark jeans, no makeup. Her eyes were alert, but her twisted fingers gave away the tug-of-war between fear and resolve. Desiree explained the deposition process. Talia nodded, saying she wasn't there to stab anyone in the back, only to make sure the truth was recorded in the right place. She began speaking. Around 6 weeks before Harold died, Jada brought Talia into the team handling the estate revisions. Everything moved unusually fast. Few meetings, little explanation, lots of documents flying back and forth marked urgent and need signature ASAP. One Sunday evening, Talia returned to the office to grab a forgotten coat and saw Jada and another staff member in the conference room with a stack of unsigned documents. Jada waved her in and asked her to witness signatures. Talia did not see Harold there. When she asked, Jada brushed it off. "He just signed. We only need the witnessing now. It's a small thing. Help me get it done quickly." Talia knew it wasn't proper procedure, so she quietly logged it in her calendar. 7:43 p.m. Sunday. Witnessed signatures for J.H. not present. That note now lay in front of us, right beside the copy of the document that had supposedly been signed. Desiree asked a few more questions. The timestamps on the files? When she first received the draft? Which provisions disappeared between versions? Talia answered clearly, with no bitterness, no victim act. She simply recounted signature dates that didn't match the metadata, sections mentioning my co-trustee role being quietly removed, legal language streamlined in a way that concentrated power in Jada's hands. Then Talia shared one more detail that left the whole room silent. Once, passing by Jada's office, she overheard part of a phone call. Jada was talking about silent liquidation, fast disbursement before things get more complicated. That call had taken place 2 days before Harold's final hospitalization. "I knew something was wrong," Talia said, her voice low but firm. "But I had a mortgage, a small child, and a job I couldn't risk losing. Back then, I stayed quiet. But now, with everything in the open, I can't stay quiet anymore." She signed the statement and dated it. Desiree thanked her, and Marcus personally walked her to the door. When the door closed, Desiree placed both hands flat on the table and spoke slowly. "This is the peace we needed. It's no longer just a feeling. It's a witness, timestamps, language indicating manipulation. Enough to put in front of a judge and request a full review of the trust administration." Marcus leaned back in his chair and exhaled as if shedding a weight, and I thought only one thing. In this moment, if Jada doesn't know yet, she's about to, and a person like Jada never panics. She plans. 2 days later, everything began. I received a thick envelope printed with the logo of the law firm representing Jada. Fine paper, bold ink, words as cold as steel. They accused me of interfering with a lawful transfer of the estate, acting out of grief, misunderstanding, and personal bitterness, threatening to seek legal costs if I did not withdraw my petition within 10 business days. I read it 3 times. On the 4th, I folded it, set it beside my cold cup of coffee, then picked up the phone and called Marcus. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I have lived through days far worse than this, Marcus," I replied. "Right now, I'm just done being silent. Silence does not mean surrender." There was a soft, brief, genuine chuckle on the other end. That afternoon, Desiree filed a formal response, attaching Talia's deposition, the calendar notes, metadata evidence, Harold's old draft documents, and system logs showing Harold never entered the building on that Sunday night, the time the documents were supposedly signed. The file was thick, heavy, not just heavy with paper, but with a message. We are not making trouble. We are simply refusing to let the truth be buried. That evening, I sat out on the porch with a thin blanket and a hot cup of tea. For the first time, what I felt inside wasn't sorrow or rage, but something else: steadiness. A sense that no matter how much red ink Jada used to rewrite Harold's story, that ink was now starting to seep back onto her own hands. The invitation arrived in a cream envelope, slipped under the door. Not Jada's signature, but from the Foundation's board, those who had stood with Harold from the beginning. The wording was very polite: a formal meeting at the Foundation's new office to finalize the transition of executive authority. Not a single word about the lawsuit. Not a line about the petition contesting the will. The tone suggested everything was settled. This was just the final formality. I read it once, then folded it and set it down on the table like a throwaway advertisement. But inside, I knew this was Jada's stage. She wanted me to witness the moment she sat in the chair Harold had always assumed I would help him protect. I called Desiree and told her I would go. Marcus wanted to come with me. I refused. "I don't need anyone shielding me in that room," I said. "I just need the truth to walk in there with me." On Thursday, I arrived 5 minutes early. The new Foundation office was a gleaming glass box, marble floors, elevators so smooth they seemed to swallow sound. The receptionist led me into the conference room. I recognized a few faces, people who had once raised glasses in my dining room, who used to call me Angela, who had praised my roast chicken. They smiled politely, but no one asked what I had been through. Jada sat at the head of the table, dark blue suit, hair in a neat bun, minimalist watch, white shirt. A perfect portrait of executive authority. When she saw me, her smile froze for half a second, then smoothed over again. I took the seat at the far end of the table. The meeting began with numbers, reports, plans, language full of jargon and short on heart. Then came the transfer of executive oversight agenda item. Jada stood and spoke about Harold's legacy, about continuity, about responsibility. Everything was prepared: her voice, her pauses, each carefully placed glance. Then she mentioned me. She said I had been by Harold's side from the earliest days, helping to build the Foundation's roots. It sounded lovely, until she added, "And now, with broad support, and with my mother's grace, I will continue carrying this legacy forward." My grace, as if I had willingly handed it over, as if I had bowed my head. I didn't argue. I simply slipped my hand into my pocket and took out a thin envelope. I passed it to Harold's longtime friend seated next to me, an elder board member. He opened it, glanced through it, and his face froze for just a moment. Inside were a copy of Talia's notarized statement, an excerpt from Desiree's legal brief, and the trust page showing Jada's revisions, the part where my name had been crossed out. He said nothing. He just passed it to the next person, then the next. Within minutes, that envelope had gone around the table. Jada saw it. Her smile began to stiffen. Her fingers stopped moving on the tabletop. I remained silent. No speech, no accusations. The papers were speaking for me. When the envelope found its way back to me, I stood. "Thank you for the invitation," I said, my voice calm. "If anyone here needs clarification, my attorney will be more than happy to assist." I nodded, then turned and walked out. Not hurried, not furious, just a woman returning to her rightful place in the story. That evening, Desiree called. A board member had approached her. They wanted to delay the transfer, to demand an independent internal review before taking any further steps. Marcus said something I will never forget. That moment at the table was not a showdown. It was a shift in power. Jada had assumed I was gone. She had not expected me to come back with the truth. The days that followed were strangely quiet. No more threatening letters, no sharp emails, no phone calls from Jada's lawyers. Desiree reminded me, when everything goes this quiet, it usually means people are recalculating their moves. But this time, I was no longer the one curled up waiting. I had said what I needed to say. The rest was theirs to face. I slowly returned to small routines, watering the plants, cooking the soup Harold used to love, reading the paper by the window. The world shrank back down to ordinary gestures, but inside me, my own place had shifted. On Sunday, Desiree called. Jada would no longer oppose the trust investigation. On the contrary, she announced she was stepping down from her role as executive director managing the foundation. There was no confession, just a polished statement about protecting the foundation's reputation and honoring Harold's legacy. I didn't cheer, didn't pop open a bottle. I simply stepped onto the porch and took a deep breath of thin, cold winter air. The feeling was very clear. This wasn't victory. It was the scales finally stopping their tilt toward the wrong side. A few days later, the foundation released a public statement confirming interim transfer to a new oversight committee made up of members who had worked directly with Harold. Marcus sent me a copy, along with a small handwritten note from an older board member. You were right to protect what matters. Not an apology, but an acknowledgement, for a woman whom, at least once, they had treated as if she'd been erased from the story. Desiree laid out our final options. We had every basis to keep going, to seek damages, even to pursue charges if we wanted. I listened, took it all in, then shook my head. I don't want to drag this out any longer, I said. I don't need money. I need just one thing, that my name be put in its rightful place in the history I spent my life helping to build. Time passed more lightly after that. No more court dates, no more counting days waiting for responses, no more feeling suspended between paperwork and signatures. One morning, I went to the garden behind the community center, the place where Harold and I had stood together at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The air was still cold, the soil still hard, but underneath, bulbs had already been planted. Daffodils, irises, crocuses. They were silent, but preparing to bloom. On the old plaque, the inscription was still there. For those who plant for a future, they may not live to see. There was a time I thought that future had been erased by one person's ambition. But it hadn't. It had only been temporarily covered. And now, layer by layer, the soil was being lifted away. On another afternoon, I opened Harold's old drawer and found an unlabeled envelope. Inside was the will from a year before everything was altered, along with his handwritten notes in the margins just for me, about trips we'd take, dinner table conversations, and how the part of legacy more important than money is keeping the original values intact. He hadn't left that version at the courthouse. He'd left it at home. For me. I took it to Marcus and asked him to preserve it, not to use in litigation, but so history would have a place to set that paper down. A few weeks later, the new board invited me to visit the foundation, not with a title, not for a speech. They simply wanted to hear me talk about the early days, about the true spirit Harold had dreamed of for the foundation. I went, looked through some files, suggested a few small details. As I left, I realized that glass building no longer made me feel small. It was just a shell. The story inside, finally, was back in the right hands. That night, I lit a candle in the kitchen, made tea, and sat by the window. I thought about Harold, with all his flaws and all his honest love, Talia, with her quiet courage, Marcus and Desiree, who stood on the side of the truth, not just for a fee, and about myself, the woman who had once sat silent at a will reading, then one day stood up, stepped back into the center of the story, and wrote the ending with her own hands. Spring that year came slowly, but it came. Flowers bloomed in the community garden. The street in front of the foundation burst with early tulips. I received an invitation to the annual fundraising gala, the kind I hadn't attended in years. This time, I went. I pinned Harold's little oak lapel pin back onto my collar, not to show off, but to remind myself, some roots grow deep enough that no one can erase them with a single stroke of a pen. At the event, the young host mentioned my name, thanking me for steadfastly protecting the foundation's original mission. The whole room turned and applauded, softly but genuinely. I simply stood, nodded, and sat back down. No more words needed. That night, on my way home, I passed the bookstore Harold used to visit every Sunday. The owner had placed his favorite novel in a spot where everyone could see it. I smiled, not from sadness, but from the feeling that I had finally returned to my rightful place in this life. I was no longer a name crossed out of a will. I was someone who had lived, loved, built, and refused to let anyone tell that story without me in it. If my story reminds you of a time you were belittled, pushed to the edges of your own life, I hope it reminds you of this. Silence is not always weakness, but one day you will need to speak to defend the truth that belongs to you. And if you want to keep hearing stories about people who seemed powerless, but dared to stand up and reclaim their voice, their respect, and their place in their families, their legacies, their own lives, hit subscribe and turn on the notifications. Every week I'll share more journeys like that, sometimes painful, always honest, and maybe, just maybe, you'll find a piece of yourself in them.